theologians often don't help us very much in this whole task of getting grace. Now please, nobody should think for a moment that I'm speaking against theologians. Theologians are wonderful and much to contribute to the church. But I'll just be honest, I've read a lot of theology about grace. And a lot of them don't have many clear or helpful answers. Matter of fact, one of the most brilliant theologians of Christianity was a man named Augustine, right, from North Africa. However, even Augustine, as great as a theologian as he was at a loss of words when it came to describing grace. In one place he wrote this. He said, "What is grace?" He said, "I know until you ask me." Now, oftentimes theologians will divide up grace into all different kinds of categories. And I've studied each one of these as an aspect of theology. They talk about prevenient grace, subsequent grace, habitual grace, actual grace, external grace, internal grace, common grace, irresistible grace, sufficient grace, and one of my favorites, efficacious grace. Now I gotta say, I'm not trying to say that there's no meaning in these different titles, there's no understanding. There is, and they all have their role in this deep study of what the grace of God might be. But I have to say, for you and I, oftentimes, all this different splitting it up in minutia tends to dilute a true understanding of what grace is. You see, I think many theologians sort of go astray from a real New Testament understanding of grace because they fail to realize, or maybe I should say this, maybe they realize it, they just don't emphasize it. They fail to emphasize that the grace of God is personal. It's more than just a description of God's action or God's power to help us. God's grace describes how God feels about us. Picture the face of God looking down from you on heaven. What is the expression on His face? Is it that look of irritation or annoyance that you saw so often from your parents or from a teacher or from some other person in authority? Is it that look of perpetual disappointment? That look of, I hope they'll do better? Or is it a more pleasant expression? Grace helps us understand the countenance of God towards His people from heaven. Grace, as the New Testament understands it, it's not a cold, technical word. It's filled with warmth. It's filled with God's love and affection. And when we see grace as too abstract, as too overly technical, it leads us to exactly the kind of graceless Christianity that we're trying to avoid. I want to spend a little time just considering this idea of grace from the New Testament and understanding this great ancient word, charis. Now, this ancient Greek word charis had a lot of different ideas to it. And when the apostolic writers, inspired by the Holy Spirit, when they began to write the Gospels, when they began to write the letters that make up our New Testament, they had the ancient Greek word charis at hand to communicate the New Testament idea of grace. And so if you want to understand what the New Testament has to say about grace, you have to begin with an understanding of what the ancient Greek word charis meant to its ancient users. I just want to get across to you the concept. This ancient word charis, it's a word full of nuance and subtle variety. You know what it's like to translate a word from one language to another, right? Sometimes you can't define that word with just one meaning. It'll have a lot of different aspects to it. That ancient Greek word charis is just like that. You can't really adequately define it with just one word. So let me go over with you some of the ideas behind this Old New Testament word of charis. First of all, connotes something, as you see up there on the PowerPoint, something that brings happiness and satisfaction. Charis could be applied to something that, and I'll quote here from one commentator, he says, something that awakens pleasure or secures joy. You see, in ancient days, if you went to a chariot race and the entertainment of the contest was pleasing to watch, you might say that the chariot races had charis. James Moffat, a great scholar of a few generations ago, he put it well this way when he wrote, what rejoiced men was called charis. In modern times, we use a word taken from charis that expresses the thought world. What do we call somebody who has a magnetic personality, a unique charm? You just like them right away. What do we call them? We call them charismatic. Charismatic, right? They have a charismatic personality. Second, that ancient Greek word could be applied to something that is beautiful. Charis carried with it the thought of beauty, and it's very logical, right? Because beauty gives us pleasure. Beauty gives us joy. It awakens joy within us. And even today, when we see a dancer or an athlete who moves beautifully, how do we describe their movement? We say it's graceful. They're full of grace. And by saying this, we use the word grace for things that have beauty and style. The person who has grace, there's a beauty and elegance about how they move. We don't think of a graceful person to be marked by blemish and deformity. And much of that sense of the ancient Greek word charis has been carried over into our English word. We think about it with the English word grace. I mean, just think about these words. Someone in shame and dishonor is disgraced, right? Someone who is favored and blessed is graced. Someone who does something beautiful and pleasant is graceful. And so these same ideas bleed into our English appreciation. Third idea, the ancient word charis carried with it the idea of supernatural power and help. Charis in those ancient times was used to describe supernatural power or aid. In the literature of ancient Greece, charis was sometimes seen as mystical power that could supernaturally influence the personality of man with its goodness and beauty. In other words, in the ancient Greek conception, I'm not talking about a Christian conception, I'm talking about a pagan conception, but they thought of the gods as sending grace upon man, as doing it to give them some supernatural power and help. And so it was common for the ancients to think of the gods bestowing this supernatural grace upon man. One other aspect, main aspect I would say, that explains this ancient Greek word charis, our English word grace, it had to do with undeserved kindness, approval, and acceptance. Charis carried with it the idea of an unmerited, undeserved favor or attitude of kindness. It was regarded as the active expression of aid and help. The famous Greek philosopher Aristotle put it in this way: helpfulness towards someone in need, not in return for anything, nor that the helper might get anything, but for the sake of the person who is helped. I'll say that one more time. Helpfulness towards someone in need, not in return for anything, nor that the helper may get anything, but for the sake of the person who is helped. Now that's how Aristotle defined this ancient Greek word charis. So charis could be used in reference to an unexpected blessing or treat, such as an unforeseen gift or a benefit. The reason for giving a charis gift was always in the giver, not in the receiver. Now that's sort of a basic understanding of this New Testament idea of grace, this ancient word charis. Something that brings happiness and satisfaction, something beautiful, supernatural power and help, and then finally undeserved kindness, approval, and acceptance. Now, you might say, well, wonderful. The writers of the New Testament, Paul and Peter and John and all the rest of them, they just took this ancient Greek word charis and they carried over to the concept into the New Testament and they adopted it full over. No! They kind of did that, but not completely. Matter of fact, there's an important difference between the two. Let me read you a quote from a man named Kenneth Wiest, who makes the same point in another way. He says this: grace signified in classical authors a favor done out of the spontaneous generosity of the heart without any expectation of return. Of course, this favor was always done to one's friend and never to an enemy. But when charis comes into the New Testament, it takes an infinite leap forward, for the favor God did at Calvary was for those who hated him. You see the huge difference? So in many ways we understand this New Testament word charis from its ancient context, but not in every way. They took this great concept of charis and they applied it in an entirely different way. Yet as a whole, and I'll say, the word kept the same idea in the New Testament. When Paul and the other New Testament writers used this word charis, they kept its associations of joy and favor and supernatural help.